Goeiemiddag dames en here, ek is Elmarie Joint van Senwes, baie welkom vanmiddag hier by ons. Dis die 7de sessie, die week van nasie in gesprek. Dis 'n baie relevante tema wat ons vandag bespreek. Geniet die middag saam met ons. Baie dankie. Ons gaan net ook 'n kort video vir u wys, om net so 'n bietjie die scene te set.
The modern consumer is spoilt for choice and has access to information from around the globe. Add to this a growing awareness of the environmental impact of individual choices, and it's clear that producers need to take note of changing consumer preferences, from production practices to packaging and beyond. As exports play a critical role in the South African agricultural sector, what are the international trends and standards we need to adhere to ensure South Africa can stay competitive in a changing international landscape?
So across the spectrum of agricultural commodities produced in South Africa, the focus and the market of the various products is quite different, and the consumer base that these products are marketed to is quite different in terms of income levels, in terms of where the consumers are situated, in terms of factors that they consider when making their decisions to buy a product. If you look at something like horticulture, it's primarily export orientated, so more than half of those exports go into the European Union, for instance. Here you're dealing with a high-income consumer, mature consumer that maybe is less sensitive to economic factors but cares about things like sustainability of packaging, like conditions on farm, like the carbon footprint of the product in terms of how it reached the market, how long the value chain is, etc. So if you think of another commodity, something like meat, for instance, is primarily delivered to domestic consumers. But here you have a very intricate market balance. Something like our beef sector exports only 5% of production, but these are high-value premium cuts going into international markets, which then enable our producers to deliver the rest of the carcass at more affordable prices to our local consumers. With our own local market, we have, again, a broad range of consumer incomes that we're dealing with. But a big share of that sits in your lower income brackets, and here affordability and value for money is key. So if we can deliver a more affordable product to these consumers, we have significant opportunity to grow consumption. With something like cereals, you're dealing with a much more basic food crop, a food staple, particularly in Southern Africa. Here, South Africa has produced a big surplus for a number of years now, so our maize, for instance, is amongst the most affordable in the world. And then in the rest of the sub-Saharan Africa region, we have some of the most expensive maize in the world. So therein lies a significant export opportunity. But of course, up in Africa, your consumer is looking for non-GM white maize, which is not always what's produced in South Africa. So there would be some decisions for producers to make in terms of where those products would ultimately be destined to.
Apart from high-value crops aimed at the higher-end consumer and export markets, there is also a growing need for affordable, nutritious food for a growing population, and these consumers are becoming increasingly sophisticated.
The consumer is the most important role player in the value chain. They have the purchasing power, and without them, and without their willingness to purchase our products, the value chain ceases to exist. Satisfying these consumer needs and wants are therefore, or should therefore, be a collective effort from the value chain stakeholders' sides. This is, however, difficult in a country like South Africa, where we have a very diverse consumer base. We have consumers on the one end whose main priority is food security and food safety, whereas on the other end we have more sophisticated consumers who prefer things like sustainable food production, ethical production, and then also knowing the origin of the product in terms of provenance. This is difficult because these types of characteristics often require sophisticated traceability systems and the necessary signals to signal that to the consumer. This is costly, and the value chain stakeholders are often not keen to carry that specific cost. On the other hand, we also have the consumers that's not always sure if they should trust these signals, and that also brings about a whole different array of problems.
The informal market plays a massive role in South Africa's economy, and this segment shouldn't be underestimated.
So the size of the informal economy is seriously underestimated. Just so we look at, there's about 500,000 hawkers in South Africa selling a range of agricultural products and other products. And in some work done in the Warwick Street Triangle in Durban, there's about 120 traders selling boiled millies, and they sell almost 28 tons of millies a day and turnover around about R1 million a week, and that's just in that Durban area. Then we go to the spaza sector. That's 100,000 outlets turning over 150 billion rand a year, including products like maize meal and so on. And then we can go to the gasiko sector, the fast food sector. That's 90 billion rand a year business across 50,000 outlets, also utilizing products like maize meal and pap and so on. So a really, really big sector.
A growing consumer awareness of where their food comes from and how it's presented will place new demands on the sector, like convenience, traceability, transparency, ethical practices, and sustainability. Fulfilling these demands successfully will determine the future profitability and sustainability of producers.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this session. Welcome to my panelists. I think it's an incredibly important topic, simply because right at the end, all food ends up on somebody's plate. And that somebody on his plate, it ends up make choices. And those choices might change over time. And those choices differ from a plate in Beijing to a plate in London to a plate in Rio de Janeiro to a plate in Delhi. But all those plates have an impact on the food production chain. Starts with a farmer and end on somebody's plate. Now, this is the 12th year we've had the Nation and Conversation discussions. These discussions have evolved over time. But I'd just like to welcome Francois Strydom, the CEO of Senvest. Now, Francois was from day one. This was his brainchild, and he's been the driving force behind and the patron for Nation in Conversation. Francois, thank you very much. So let me introduce my panel today. And I think you're all aware of the importance of the topic, but on my far side is Wolf Broad. He's manager, Labbased Fruit. Wolf, thank you very much. Then Johan van Deventer, CEO Freshpack, retired. Johan, thank you very much. Welcome Professor Naushad Imambau, I hope that was correct, from the University of Pretoria. And next to me, Marina Fourie, she's Project and Brand Manager, Red Meat Industry Services. Professor, I'm going to start with you. This is your field of study, the consumer behavior in terms of food. If you were to take a step back and look at the big trends currently in the consumer's food behavior, what would you highlight?
Okay, if I see this, firstly, maybe we can just see, what is driving these new trend. I think from a food science perspective, when we look at us at the university, we do lots of research there. We look at what drive what we need to do as a research work. And we see that there is a triple burden of malnutrition from a health perspective. This is what drives our research. And this triple burden of malnutrition is, firstly, is undernutrition. Okay, it's mostly affecting the low-income consumers. And then we also have people who have overconsumption. And this is related to diet-related non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular diseases, as well as related to obesity. And also we've got the macronutrient deficiency, or what people sometimes talk about hidden hunger. Okay, these really drive our agenda at the university, look at the new trend of food. And what are the main causes from a food science perspective now? There are a lot of other causes, can be health issues, but from our side, it's really the consumption of high energy dense food rather than nutrient dense food. So
high energy versus nutrient dense. Can you just specify that a bit?
High energy dense food is mostly food that has a lot of sugars, mostly calories, like sugars, fat, and also things like lots of refined flour, where it's digested very fast, and it increases the what's called the glucose level very fast in the blood. So these are things that we look at. So in terms of that now, when we look at new trend, so people are looking mostly at things that has low energy, mostly like then the trend start like whole grain food. There's a lot in the market. The other thing is we have a lot of trend. Again, it's carrying on like low-fat food or low sugar food, low-salt food. I think this is still trendy, and it's going to be trendy again for a health reason. And the other thing that I will say is also nutrient-dense food. Okay. Where there is a lot of pack of nutrients in terms of a lot of protein, the balance between all the nutrients, protein, the carbohydrate, and also very important, the micronutrients in terms of the vitamins and the minerals. And the other thing that I will say, I mean, you will talk a lot about sustainability. So the important also here, whatever we do in terms of the consumer, like in the short video, we see that they want to, especially the high-end consumer, they want to see what is happening, what is the carbon footprint of the product that they are eating at the end of the day.
So that, again, pushes back to the producer of that specific food.
Exactly. From the producer to the processor, and also to the retailer.
I'm going to come back to those different segments, specifically from the income level and how that trends move. But Johan, as time when you were in charge of or a large portion of the fruit and vegetable market in terms of distribution and in terms of measuring and matching client behavior, if you were to look at the last number of years, let's make it 5 or 10 years, what has been the major changes that you have seen on the one side, but also which of these changes do you foresee continuing in the future?
So yeah, just the name is Freshmark, but part of Shoprite Checkers. But to answer your question, maybe I would like to start off by saying in the last 30 years, if you look at product, on the vegetable side, number 1 is still potatoes, number 2 is still basically onions, and number 3 more or less tomatoes. And then, but the changes took place in these categories. And then on the fruit side, number 1 apples, number 2 bananas, and number 3 more or less citrus. And if you think about the citrus industry and what happened in the last couple of years on the soft peelers, it just exploded. Okay, we can say it's because of a drive for the overseas market, which is true, but it is also very popular lately to consume soft peelers and pitless product. That's the in thing, although we can't get it right with watermelons, but that's another point. But in those categories or product lines that I've mentioned, a lot of changes did take place, again, according to the different income groups. Your upper class, in terms of income, prefer a more sophisticated product, and you will see it in the, I don't know whether we can mention brands, stores out there in the real world, the Woolworths, the Checkers.
Yeah, comfortable, you can name them.
The Checkers, X's, who really are tackling that top bracket in the consumer market with bigger choices. We've seen the video, and give the customer, and it's all about convenience. And then load shedding also have an effect. That top income group have a preference now for ready to eat. To take it home is not prepared to go into a lot of preparation to get to food. So there's a lot of challenges in that bracket for our suppliers. If you work it down, what happened in the middle income group, which is, or those people are under pressure economically, they moved a little bit away from the upmarket product, the prepared and the ready to cook, and they are now more prepared to do a lot of those work themselves. If you come to the, like you said, Professor, if you come to the bottom end, that end is now really like never before looking for value for their money. They want food, and they can easily or will easily subsidize in terms of price. As long as they can get protein, they will move from potatoes, say, to rice or to bread, but they need food. So that is also a challenge. My challenge always to the potato industry was, give us potatoes that can forever sell at 19.99, 10 kg pocket, which I know is not realistic, but I'm just saying as a challenge, we must not just chase the upper market. The majority of our consumers are here in the bottom bracket.
So we sometimes emphasize the top end changes, but the bulk of the food is in the lower end of the market.
So important.
Just a question, Johan. You say that people move towards food that they want to eat today. What for me is interesting, purely as a consumer, the last number of years, even on an avocado, the ready-to-eat label, is that part of this trend?
Yeah. A big preference for, I mean, you will get consumers in, say, the Checkers, X or the Woolworths who will sort of refuse to pick up a green, because they want to consume it today.
So the avocado is for today.
And they'll pay a price for that ready to eat. And they will not pick up the green skin.
While we're on the retail side, I'm going to ask you one more question. What is the position of some of the brands, the ZZ2 in the tomato side, or we see in the citrus also Clement Gold on the soft peelers. What is the position of those?
Strong. Clement Gold opposition for that is Tango in Checkers. You know, that's how strong it is. These guys in the top market, they watch every step of the opposition, and they will follow soon if you have something special. But the brands are important. You've mentioned ZZ2. It's a brand that have built up over many years a name, and the name is coupled to quality and shelf life. So that is important, but you will also see that many of the retailers are cutting off the supplier's brand. If you walk through a chain store, you're not going to see all the brands necessarily.
Marina, in your point of view, you in the red meat industry, in terms of consumer change, consumer behavior, a few comments?
So I'm going to start off by saying that the South African consumer doesn't look the way we think they look. So we have an extremely diverse consumer population, and it is really important, as the other panel members mentioned, to know that we have different segments in our market that acts differently, and that the face of the consumer is not necessarily us. It's not your own frame of reference. So you must never think that I consume this way and that means that all consumers consume this way, or that the international trend is this, so South Africa should also behave like this. We have a very unique consumer. And when it comes to meat, there's a lot of things that can influence a consumer's meat consumption, internally and externally. Externally, we spoke about accessibility now, the economy, load shedding is huge, the energy crisis has a huge influence on consumption, and then internal influences, your own morals and values, which we see come to play now with this whole sustainability debate. And I call it a debate because it's an ongoing trend. And it's here to stay, it's not just a trend. And with meat, we assume that consumers will start feeling negatively towards meat because we see a lot of vegan alternatives or plant-based alternatives on the market. But it doesn't mean that people stopped consuming meat because of the environmental impact that they think it has. So something that we see quite clearly is a lack of knowledge amongst consumers, specifically in terms of sustainability, but also health. South African consumers understand that red meat is really really important for your health, but they can't pinpoint it necessarily. They can't take it to a specific portion size. So there's a lot of opportunity for education at this stage, which we do. It is a very important responsibility for us as the Red Meat Industry Services to take that on, consumer education, to give consumers the correct information. Talking about difficult things such as sustainability, I often say it's like talking to your kids about the things of life. You should give the facts. You should give it correctly so that they don't learn it somewhere else and they get it wrong. We see that it's important to start with basic terminology, the basic science behind greenhouse gas emissions. What is methane? Why is methane not equal to carbon dioxide? But it is a big challenge in a country that we have a very high illiteracy rate. This week we heard on the news that 80% of grade 4s cannot read with comprehension. So that makes consumer education a challenge. I believe the strongest agent for change, specifically in food consumption, is education, but we need to do it based on the consumers we target. So we need to package different messages differently for different consumers. Yes.
Can I just add on about the education for the consumer? I think that's, Marina, is very, very important about the low literacy consumers. I mean, how do we communicate with them? I think that's also it's also a very new trend. I mean, in one of the projects that we are busy with, it's a European funded project. It's called InnoFood Africa. And there we have we are doing nutritional surveys, we have lots of food ingredient that we are developing. We are working with the farmers participatory research, and also we're looking at biopackaging. But at the end of the day, how do we take this message across to the consumers? So we also have a work package here that is called communication, where we are involving people from the University of Pretoria there's a center there known as augmentative and alternative communication, where they're taking what we are writing and put it to a level, grade 6 level. And also with infographic, I think that will make a huge difference.
For people to understand
what are our outcome or outputs there, especially from a nutrition point of view, what we found out. So,
Wolf International, let's move it slightly, because South Africa's value chains produce food for international markets. We are an exporter of food, and these markets, obviously, what's happening in those markets is critical for the sustainability of our value chain. Your view on what's happening international?
Well, I mean, if we look at our overall production, just over half of our production in value terms goes into exports, about 51, 52%. If you look in a sector that I'm closely involved in fruit specifically, the great majority of many of our fruit commodities is actually exported. In some cases, it's up to 80-90%. And very influenced by messaging in our traditional markets of the Americas and Europe. At the same time, we are making inroads into East Asia and Middle East, but the messaging there is culturally slower to, the interaction is not the same as with Europe and America. So we're seeing a lot of and have seen, as colleagues have said over the years, a lot of the same messages overseas getting picked up and reinforced here. And that's not to say that South African consumers themselves are not savvy enough to have come to the same conclusions. And we have a population with significant saturation of cell phones, access to information and media. And it's increasingly obvious to people who engage with anything related to sustainability that there are some serious ramifications around climate change and what's happening internationally. And people can make connections back through to production and farm management and etc. So what we're seeing is that the links are now stronger than ever before, coming back from the consumer through the retailer, back through the chain, down to the producer. Which is great in terms of meeting some of the goals that you want to meet, and in terms of increasing some of the positive impacts of changing production methods. But it does place a lot more weight on the producer. The producer is tied into very strict criteria with suppliers, whether you're supplying locally, whether you're supplying internationally. internationally, you find that you're tied into, say, Global Gap or some other competing supplier certification structures. And there's no standardized structure, unfortunately. They are competing models. They overlap to a large extent as well. But we do find that going into markets like the European market, the American market, there's very little room for error in producers and in buyers that they sell to. And it's a very competitive market. South Africa competes with suppliers in South America, with Australians, New Zealanders, even in Asia as well. And it is a blessing that we've been able to compete for many decades on quality, R&D, on price, on our fruit is very respected overseas, and our agricultural products and the standards of those in our price points. But it is something that is getting harder, I would say, for South African producers. And it's something that's increasingly going to have to be very carefully observed on the ground. Even in terms of farm management, it's whole layers of complexity in terms of traceability, admin systems, how you manage what you record, what information you can supply to go up into the criteria that for the suppliers. So it's making farming more complex, but at the same time, it's good for society, it's good for consumer health. But I would also just end by saying that, as colleagues said, these are systems in flux. Even the European Commission with the Green Deal on Farm to Fork, it's still under significant debate. So it's something that the industry has to be capacitated to track, to monitor, and to watch where it lands.
And we even see that European producers, from time to time, stand up to the changes that the world want to apply.
Yeah, very much so. Sorry.
Johan?
Phil, I think all in all, we can really lift our hats for our South African suppliers, and I'm specifically talking fruit and veg. You can throw them with any challenge. It was my experience. As we are serving in the Shoprite group, you know, from the top to the bottom end, you can say that Checkers X at the top and then USAFE at the bottom. And in Freshmark, you'll find different specs for the different chain store groups within the group. Yet our suppliers complied, and our shelves are full of food. So really, we sit with fantastic suppliers, and we can give them a compliment this afternoon. I've been to the rest of the world really intensively and served on, in America. And I think those suppliers will find it hard, in my opinion, to survive here by us in Africa.
And that goes both for the top end and the entry level?
Both from the top end and the lower end. So they take initiative many a time. It was not necessary for us to say, this is what we want and this is what we need, and you push and you must give a subsidy or any form of help. No, not at all.
You talked about, before I'm going to come to the lower end of the market, you talk about the main vegetable and the main fruit groupings basically staying the same. But within that, there's major changes.
Yes.
How would you, in terms of those major changes, is it to do with cycles, with consumer behavior, with new variants? What drives those changes within that?
I think it's both. If you look at the potato industry as an example, yes, they listen to the consumer if they say we want a blush potato or we want a firm potato. They listen to that, but I think our suppliers, potato suppliers specifically, then look for a potato that they can plant that can maybe do both. And very important, the old varieties, like say Up to Date, is just not viable to plant anymore. You need a good crop lately to survive in the potato industry due to production cost, etc., etc. We can just think what the electricity situation is doing to irrigation. And you cannot really you can't grow potatoes, I think, profitable in dry land anymore. Here and there by exception, but by the far majority is under irrigation. So yeah, you can say it's easy to put up a generator, but the generator uses fuel.
And it's got a cost implication.
It's enormous, enormous. So if you can find a potato that can give you a good crop, 7,000 or 8,000 bags per hectare, that's sellable, and it can keep Madam Customer happy, you in business. But to have that speciality potato, our suppliers have tried. You know, it's a niche market. You can have different color in your potatoes, but it's a niche market too small to be commercial.
And that people need to understand.
That people need to understand, because it's not that our suppliers, we keep on talking now about potato suppliers, it's not that they sit back and say, we ignore the fact that there can be purple potatoes and yellow potatoes, etc., which you will find in the rest of the world maybe. But it is just not viable to do it on a big scale, because they are not going to buy it. And sometimes to plant those niche, as I will call them, potatoes, and to grow them, the crop then at the end is lower, so the cost is higher.
And the market's not there.
It's not prepared to pay that premium for the potato because it's of a different color. Not, I would say not in South Africa. In the majority, the far majority of consumers will not fork out that money for a different in color.
Professor, we in a grain area, maize area, very big in this area, and that's also the staple food for the bulk of the South African population. So on the one hand, we're in the area where if you look at the equipment, if you look at the technology, it's based on supplying that staple. That's also the staple for the majority of the South African population. You've done a lot of work in that market and around that staple. Can you give us some indication what your research have found and what's of interest?
Okay, most of the cereal grain right now, I mean, if it's milled, it's become a refined flour. And when it's become a refined flour, and you will produce bread with it, for example, from wheat or maize, it will go as, you will buy it and maize pap at home. And both of them are considered as a medium or high GI. I mean, it's not, it's supposed to be slightly medium or lower GI for a better health, for make it more healthy. So what we are doing right now, I mean, especially both at the DSI NRF Center of Excellence in Food Security, as well as various projects like the EU project, Food Africa, we are seeing, for example, bread. I mean, if you buy bread, it's mostly with what's called, it's wheat. Okay, in South Africa, we do import quite a lot of wheat. Okay, so we are not self-sufficient in it. So how, for example, can we use other grain available, especially the pulses or what we call legume grain? I think in this area also, we also produce, for example, cowpea. How can we use this grain now to fortify, okay, to enrich the bread so that somebody buy the bread, it can have both the starch as well as the protein at the same time. So we are working on that now. And I think in the project, I think some of the partners, especially some of the European partners, especially one specifically with North Puratos. We all have also Puratos here, which is a Belgium company. They've been working on incorporating the cowpea in bread, and they managed to put up to 40% there, which is very good. Okay, so, in terms of the bread. In terms of maize meal now, people like to eat maize meal because it's, I mean, they are used to it. It's a traditional food. But how can we use the maize meal to make it slightly, making it low GI? I think we've done some work on there. I mean, where we can, I don't want to go into more technical there, but there are ways to do that. We can complex some of the what's called starches that are there, and making the starches more in terms recognized as dietary fiber. And dietary fiber is also the nutrient here. That's why whole grain is there, which is very important for the gut health. So the dietary fiber, if you can make maize meal, making make some of the starch become dietary fiber, I think that is a plus there. I gave you 2 examples in terms of the wheat and maize. But we should also not ignore some of the other grain, especially the pulses. And we're also doing, the main objection of the pulses, sometimes people tend to talk about the beanie flavor. And even in the project, we found ways to reduce the beanie flavor so that we can use it there. And my colleague here said that sometimes there is no market, for example, from some of the unique one. But I think one need to also look at, for example, the legume, you talk about grains here, we talk about mostly grains, like the cowpea or even, there is, the potential that is there globally. For example, pea is quite huge in Europe now, whether it's pea protein concentrate or pea protein isolate. So why can't we have certain things like that here? The farmers producing the cowpea, and then we build in a processing plant to make the cowpea, making cowpea concentrate, protein concentrate, and this can be an export market to produce TVP. And this is quite huge now in Europe from a sustainability point of view. So these are things that is the trend that, and the research that we are doing.
What drives the behavior of that consumer? Is it to a large extent purely price?
Okay, we talk about the concept that we have. We talk about SMART. Okay, it's an acronym. S for safe, M should be marketable, the food. Okay, in terms of consumer, it should be safe. Okay, when you look at things, I should be able to buy it, and it's affordable. Okay, and we talk about convenience or ready to eat. And the taste also is very important. So these are, for me, the drivers, what the consumer look like. And in the especially the lower-end consumers, they will look mostly affordability. And as you get a bit higher, it's mostly convenience. I think convenience is also very important. I think even lower-end consumers, I mean, sometimes they won't even have time to make the pap, so they will just buy bread. And bread is a high GI produce. I mean, especially white bread. Okay? Because on the other hand, if you talk about whole grain or whole wheat bread, I think some people, in terms of when they eat it, they don't like it a lot because there is lots of fiber in the mouth that causes rejection. When you're eating it, the oral processing when you're eating it, it's not very tasty. So I think the other aspect is, as food scientists, how we can make food tasty and at the same time healthy.
I'm going to get to you, Marina, just now. I just want to ask Johan and Wolf perhaps another question in terms of what they were saying. It seems that the theme of convenience comes through continuously. Has there been a change in terms of convenience and buying patterns from your side? Firstly, Johan, and then perhaps in the fruit side, Wolf.
No, definitely. If I can refer to that Checkers X again, you will not find a pumpkin on the shelf for sale. You will definitely find cut pumpkin,
interesting,
or peeled pumpkin, and I can carry on with other lines as well.
That shows the consumer will only buy, that's what they want to buy.
Yes.
Whereas in the lower end of the market, servicing another market,
the whole pumpkin you will find in the USafe and you will find it in the ShopRite, but not at the upper end of the market.
Want to add something, Wolf?
Yeah, no. I would say in terms of convenience, you know, there's a healthy eating push overseas, and we have it over here as well, to see fruit as a healthy snack. And you try and sell, in essence, sort of not single-use portions, but single portions and loose portions. And this is now overlapping with the packaging debate in Europe.
Yeah.
And the pushback against single-use packaging in Europe. And as you'd said earlier, the European industry is actually now pushing back themselves against this trend and saying, look, now you're going to, by changing the packaging, have impact in terms of the cold storage methodology, in terms of when you harvest, in terms of what labeling opportunities you have, what display of labeling you can do with packaging, in terms of shelf life, etc., etc. But it does allow you to sell loose servings. But I would say that on our side, we're still seeing the more traditional portion sizes. You'll still see what you usually get, but we have the same time the introduction of this like smaller buy and go, take it as a healthy snack. And I'm like
ready to eat then.
Yeah, ready to eat, grab and go, especially in terms of convenience. And we find also post-COVID, of course, there's been increased emphasis on what you eat and the vitamin and healthy eating and etc. Unfortunately, that seems to be wearing off fairly fast in the fruit sector, and especially in Europe with fruit consumption falling. But it did provide a nice boost at that point, and it reinforced in the consumer's consciousness that fruits and vegetables are still, as they've always been, extremely healthy choices. Yeah.
Marina, let's go back to the other side of the plate, the meat side, of the protein side. Obviously, protein, it depends on the cut that you're talking about, but it's a high-end market product in some areas and a part of a healthy diet in certain other areas. What drives the consumer at the top end of the market, and then where does the consumer at the bottom end of the market, or let's say the lower end of the market, how does that behavior change?
So it's interesting to see that South Africans in the top end of the market, as you call it, and the bottom end, tend to prefer rather the same cuts. We see from our research that consumers from all the income groups prefer to buy something like mince for an everyday meal. But when you start talking about special occasions, then it starts to differ, because special occasions differ in different cultures. But what I want to backtrack to, with what all the panel members mentioned, is consumer insights. So we need proper segment-specific and product-specific consumer insights to inform producers what it is that consumers want. So you can give them very rigid specs according to what the European countries want. And you can give a potato farmer the freedom to plant their very resilient crops, or you can develop a modified starch in a lab. But is that what your consumer can use? And that's really important, and what I also want to urge producers, to urge their commodity organizations to do, is to get more consumer insight. What is it that consumers want to do with potatoes? But I know that Potatoes SA and the ShopRite Group has done a lot of research into that. What is it that the European consumer specifically wants? Is it worth the producers' while to spend a lot of money and invest in a lot of infrastructure to meet those specs? The same with red meat. We're looking at the buzz term now, climate smart agriculture, where organizations such as the World Bank is trying to get South African banks involved in incentivizing climate smart agricultural practices on farm level. But the question that the producers will ask is, will my consumer care? Will this make my product sell quicker and easier and at a premium price, perhaps?
Especially if there's cost involved.
Especially when there's cost involved. So there's still a lot of work to do in terms of consumer insights. Like I said previously, we assume that a consumer feels a certain way, but it isn't necessarily that. We need to make sure that something like a specific starch used in terms of calorie use is accepted by the consumer. I've had the privilege now to work with some of Prof. Norshad's starches at the university, where I also work part-time, in terms of culinary application. And there's still a lot to do when it comes to different grains in terms of digestibility, taste specifically, mouthfeel as mentioned. And yeah, so we have a long way to go in terms of South African consumer insights.
But then you also say that the consumer is not it's not one specific group. It's a complex issue. Where does that fit in?
So we need to do segment-specific consumer insight research. You need to know who the consumer is that you are targeting, and you need to get to know them, not make assumptions of what they want. And then with the red meat industry, yes, we target South Africans, definitely, but the goal is to export. We saw in the introduction video that we only export 5% of what we produce. We aim, I think it's 20% by 2030. And to be able to do that, you need to develop your international market. You need to know what it is that they want, how they accept your product, the cuts that they want. So we need to invest a lot in that type of research. Also do a lot of work on the animal health side, because if that's not done, then we can't export. But yes, there's a lot still to be done in terms of developing the market for South African
Wolf,
products.
I'm going to give you a difficult question now. You're the only person on this panel that represents organized agriculture. The view from Marina is that part of the responsibility of the commodity groupings and commodity entities, commodity organizations in South Africa, should be a much bigger emphasis on understanding the consumer. Do you agree with that? Is that the responsibility? Are we taking that seriously enough?
Well, I mean, AgBiz, for example, has 1/3 of its membership are organizations, associations, ranging from, say, citrus growers through to poultry association and to animal feed, etc. And we know that we are blessed with very high capacity organizations in this country, industry associations. It's amazing the level of capacity. A little bit biased in that I have more awareness of the capacity in the fruit sector, and it's quite remarkable. But it's the foresight over decades that I think has been referred to by colleagues, that without that we would not be in the position we are in terms of our global profile, in terms of our quality, in terms of our production methodology. A lot of R&D, a lot of careful use of funds, a lot of careful use of grower capacity development. I would say the association mandates are the key, because you'll find that quite a few associations, their mandates might actually be primarily market access. But then you can dovetail the two, because you can say what is consumer preferences in those export markets. But it's in terms of consumer insights in the local market as well. I would say, yes, it is definitely a role that industry associations can play, because if there's going to be a misalignment of your choice of cultivar, or your choice of what you're going to plant for in the next 2 seasons, then that's wasteful expenditure in a sense, and it could be very serious in our current situation with input costs and roads and load shedding, etc. And AgBiz has been very involved in some of these infrastructural issues and these constraints. But as we know, they're significant challenges, and they're not going to go away soon. So there's not much room to maneuver in comparison to perhaps some of our competitor industries, which have perhaps a more stable environment in which to operate as producers. But yeah, I would say, depending on the mandate of the industry association, of course mandates can be changed, consumer insights and the role that they play would be a wise investment in terms of capacity within associations, especially as these particular debates and trends are only going to get stronger. I would not expect these trends to globally to diminish. I would expect them to be reinforced.
Yes, you talk about consumer. Yes, consumer should be always the focus. But also what we do, I mean, most of our research now at the university, we are going towards a transdisciplinary type of research agenda. So for example, in food, I mean, in the area of agro-food sector, we look at the food system as a whole, across the food system, all the role players. When we have a project, we try to bring all the role players, from the farmer or the seed producer, the farmer, the processor, the retailer, and the consumer. So we bring everybody on board and try to see what is the problem there and address the problem this way. So I don't think it's only about bringing the consumer and the producer, but in between what is happening, the whole value chain, one need to have all the actors involved to really have the impact.
From your point, Johan?
Yeah, that's true. The feedback, of course, it can always improve, but what we always had as a sort of a recipe is to say that the information that's coming from the front, Madam Customer, must flow right through back to
All the way back.
all the way back to what is happening at the front. And you know, part of it is automatic if a retailer have a sophisticated intelligent system, like luckily we had with SAP system, is that who wants waste? I mean, sometimes we think a retailer can afford waste. That's the last thing that he wants because he paid for that product. You're not going back to a supplier and say, sorry, 6 or 5% of your product that we've bought went rotten because our merchandising or segmentation was wrong with that specific store. You just don't do it. So that's on your account. So automatically you make dead sure that all your stores are rightly, your ranging is correct, that you're keeping product on the shelf that's selling, and you can't afford to have the wrong product on the shelf, which is it's a fine trick, and you better be wide awake because the ordering will then go back to the farmer, and the farmer must know of this product or any of the product. I need to plant more or maybe less. Because the consumer
straight back.
That's how it should be. And like I say, some of it is luckily happening automatically.
Yeah.
Because there's a financial implication.
There's an order or not an order. There's an order with a price.
I now refer to the chain stores, but even the informal trader cannot afford to buy the wrong product. He's even more at risk. It's his money that he took this morning. He went to the market and he bought whatever he decided to buy, and that he thinks he can trade wherever he's going to sit and trade. If we ever talk about market segmentation, the informal sector are the experts. I sometimes say I think my father wasted a lot of money to send me to varsity. I could have learned from them.
From the informal trader.
From the informal trader.
I'll give you an example. We have a guy coming in on Saturdays assisting with our garden, but he first on a Saturday morning goes to the Johannesburg fresh produce market, the municipal market. And he buys stuff, packages it smaller and sells it.
Yep.
For him, quality, and that's why I asked the brand question.
Yes.
He would only buy a ZZ2 tomato. And I asked him why. He said, because I can sell all 24 tomatoes. If I can't sell one, I don't make a profit that day. And that's another way of segmentation.
Absolutely. That's why I say they are absolute experts.
What is always interesting is the amount of food that is distributed via those channels into the consumer.
That's so true. No, that is so true. And I think Mr. Adcock referred to it, that we sometimes underestimate. I'm now started my career on the Johannesburg fresh produce market, and lately I'm blessed to be involved again. But the informal trade today as a sector is by far the biggest buyer, if you can say it's a buyer's group, on the Johannesburg market.
The informal trader.
The informal traders.
Is the biggest buyer in the Johannesburg fresh produce market.
All fresh produce markets in South Africa, sometimes as big as 70 and 80% of a market's turnover will come from the informal sector buying.
And they will have a very specific behavior, understanding their client, focus on quality and focus on price.
True.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to allow, we're nearly an hour in, I am going to allow for a few questions. Is there anybody, there is a roving mic, is there anybody with a question for any of the panel members? Yes, there's a question.
I'm going to try this in English because I think the professor is probably the guy to answer this. What do you think the time frame and relevance is on the valuability of food being produced in labs in our market? Is it quicker than one we think it is? Is it 5 years, 10 years? And what the percentages will be in 10 or 5 or 15 years from now?
Very interesting question. Thank you very much. Any other question? Very interesting question.
Yes, that's very also quite controversial. I think the lab-based food, if you look about the lab-based meat, for example, I think firstly, I mean, it's still lab-based, because if you do a research, I think firstly it becomes lab, and then it becomes pilot scale, and then it becomes commercial scale. And sometimes something can take 5 to 10 years, or sometimes it can take shorter. But the lab-based one, I think, very important to think about. Firstly, I mean, for the normal consumer, it's extremely expensive. And lab-based food, I think the research also is going into it just because, I mean, there has been a lot of research, like, for example, going to Mars, okay, in terms of space exploration and people going to space. I think this is where perhaps this type of research will really go into place. And if you're looking for example, alternative meat, so for example, sources, I think maybe the TVP. I mean, now, I mean, for the last few years, there has been tremendous what's called progress in terms of the quality of texturized vegetable protein in the market. I think this is perhaps where it's more affordable in terms of the market there. Yeah, this is what I would say.
Would you say that, given that we in a farmer community audience here, is that a trend that farmers at this point should take seriously, or is it more of interest at this point in time?
I think, to be honest, I think it's more of an interest right now, because I think the market, I think the affordable, it's too expensive right now to put it out. Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
So in the international red meat industry fraternity, they've seen a very typical lifespan of these, not necessarily the lab grown, but the meat alternatives like the Impossible Burger, where it will grow very quickly because everybody's trying it, and then it will just disappear. And the reason being price and digestibility and consumer acceptance once again. So I wouldn't be worried. As a red meat industry, we're not necessarily worried about that. We also need to remember that on our South African landscape, 70% of our landscape can only be used for wildlife or cattle. So that we need to, as a red meat industry, we aim to educate consumers on that as well, that it is important for economic sustainability to keep on supporting the red meat industry. And we are organized for a formal agricultural company, the RMIs. So we serve the producers, yes. So our members are the red meat producers organization, the abattoirs, the feedlots, and the national emerging farmers. So we aim to serve them by developing the market, and one of our 4 pillars are competitiveness and sustainability. So that's something we take very seriously, and as a part of that, we do get consumer insights.
The research from the consumer side. But you still believe there can more work can be done?
Definitely, and that's what we're aiming for.
Any comment on the lab comment, Johan?
Yeah, I think one must just never use the words never. You know, we lettuce as an example, if I can use that. Okay, it's not 100% a lab, but it's moving in that direction. When I started in the industry, any lettuces in a tunnel or hydroponics was unheard of. You only read about it. And today, if you talk about lettuce, I mean, if there's any farmer who still do lettuce in the open field, he must have his head read, if I must say that. So that moved over to tunnel production because of the risk and due to you know, hail and whatever the weather, and the high input cost just forced them to go hydroponic or to be in tunnels, and so is peppers, and there's English cucumbers. So never say never.
And the consumer adapted to that quality. That's what the consumer expects.
Yes, it is in fact a better quality, more controlled, and less insecticides. It's food, really, in terms of food safety, those products are tested. And it's good, it's a win-win.
Any other questions? Any other person with a question? Right, if there's no more questions, I am going to, an hour's done, but I'm going to ask a very specific question to each and every one of you from different angles. But the question is, it's advice to producers, and I include there not only the producer, but the value chain up to the consumer. From an advisory point, if you in the agriculture value chain, or you're a grower or a producer, what should you watch in the industry? And I'm specifically, Marina, on your side in the red meat industry, Johan on the fruit and vegetables, perhaps Wolf more on the international side, and on your side, Professor, I think you've got a holistic view on it, but more on the bulk end of the food of the consumer. What should you be aware of, and what should you position yourself for in the next 5 or 10 years? So it's the value chain from the producer into the value chain. If you take a 5 or 10 year view in trends, what should you watch out for? Marina, I'll start with you.
Okay, I think advice is a very strong word here. I would just say it's, in my opinion and experience. We want to obviously export more as an industry. That's the way we're going to grow the red meat industry currently. We're not at a saturation point with local consumption, but we do need to export in order to grow the industry further, like we saw in the introduction video as well. And producers need to remember that it should be a common goal throughout the whole value chain. And to be able to export, we need healthy animals. We need good status in terms of animal health internationally. And that is a group effort, whether it's emerging farmers, whether it's your neighbor that's an informal farmer. We all need to work together to that common goal of developing the industry, of exporting, of keeping our national herd healthy.
So there's a challenge if we want to grow that export to 20-25%. You note there's a challenge in terms of making sure that the herd is healthy, so that as we grow, we can have access to those markets.
Yes, I'm not the expert on that, but that is,
that's
if I have one piece of advice, that is it.
It's around the herd and the health of the herd. Professor, from your side, what would you view as guiding lights for people producing for that segment?
Okay. From a food science point of view, I will say, I mean, the upper market, I think it's very important to look at the healthy aspect in terms of, like I mentioned before, more nutrient-dense food, but also it should be tasty at the same time. I think that's a challenge. Okay, and the lower-end market is affordability. That is very important. And one thing that, I mean, among the South African consumers or African consumers, a lot also is going towards the tradition and culture. That's what we've seen a lot. And we need to learn a lot from them to make more convenient food from there. Like fermented food, I think that's going to be also the next new things a lot. Like we talk about TVP now, I mean, it's looked true that there is still a lot of work to be done to make it more what's called palatable. Okay, and one way, for example, in some of the African countries, it's very common to have some of the pulses that are fermented, and then they use it as an ingredient in stews and things like that to add flavor. Can this be used there? And understanding these and how to commercialize it to bring it to more consumers. I think these also sort of things. And also in the next, I will say, in terms of research and also going to the consumers, I think indigenous is very important to look at indigenous food. I think we, from an African perspective, again, I mean, we talk a lot about Mediterranean diet as a very good and healthy. I mean, why can't we make it the same here? African diet, African-based diet as a healthy alternative. So these are type of things. And Marina earlier mentioned about climate-smart crops, and we would like to have more of these. But in terms of their yield potential, I mean, Obviously, it has to be techno-economically feasible for the producer, as well as for the processor and for the retailer. I think these are type of I will see in the next 5-10 years.
Johan, from an advice point for the food value chain, from the producer to the value chain?
I feel it's easy. I think the farmers, the fruit and veg farmers, must just keep on farming. They are doing an excellent job as it is. We can always improve. If there's something special, what we've found and what I've tried to preach on Farmers' Days was to say, as much as you are a precision farmer, that is most the buzzword in the industry, not only in fruit and veg, but you must really put detail and focus on what you're doing. So much so, you must be a precision marketer. What I'm trying to say by that is make sure that before you plant, that you know exactly for who you're planting. Where in that pyramid are you pitching yourself? Is it at the bottom end, where you want to just go for mass production, and you will be very price sensitive? Then you will be successful. If you're brave enough to tackle the things going up in that pyramid, then do so, but make sure that you know who's going to buy it, when are they going to buy it, what are their specs, because you cannot, with the production cost as it is, use a shotgun approach. You must be specific.
So as much time and effort as you spend on your precision farming, you must spend on the marketing of your product.
Yes.
Who are you selling to, what is the expectation, and how you're going to compete.
And then I will say, and I know it's a big argument, to say that the farmer is not going to be a price taker. He can be a bit more of a price maker as well. But if you swim just in the pool and you just, in a generic big stream market, okay, then you're going to be a price taker.
I want to just spend another few minutes on that. In order to be a price maker, therefore, you need to be slightly up on the value chain, and you need to know exactly what you're producing and what the market is.
I want to throw a name in that you used before, ZZ2. You think they are just price takers? Maybe a bit at times when there's an overproduction, but when there's a shortage, it's the product tend to go for a premium sort of always.
And that's why you need to focus on who you're going to buy, who you're going to sell to, and where you're going to play in the market.
Yes, and to be constant. People like them don't take chances. Their class 1 is a class 1. Today, tomorrow, and I think for the years to come. So it was also 20 years ago. And that is an effort to get there and to maintain that. And if you can do that, you're not just a price taker.
But you're not a shotgun guy. You know what you do.
No.
Wolf, your advice to the farmer in terms of what are you seeing in terms of the consumer?
Okay, I mean, referencing, you said let's have a reference point as the export markets. I would say the producer should firstly shop around for certification models that meet his or her needs, and there's also cost differences between the different systems, so there's a saving that can be made, and there's also then the advantage of different markets, different certification systems. I would say that the producer should also spend some time on their product backstory, if you want to put it that way. Have an awareness of what are the exciting and human elements of what you do as a producer. Think of yourself as opening someone's social feed and looking at this farm, and saying, wow, look what they do, look how they grow, look who they are, it's lovely. That relatable side of production is increasingly part of our modern life and our modern social interaction. And someone in a corner of Germany can pick up their phone and have a look at someone in Lipero and say, wow, what a nice farm there. You know, that's a brand. I wonder if that brand's in my supermarket. So those 2 points. And then the third one I would say is producers are going to have to be open to be flexible in terms of their crop management tools. We're seeing increasing change and trends towards changing of crop management tools that are acceptable, what's not acceptable. We've seen changes to our South African lists already. The registrar has already now put out changes, and there's engagements by organized agriculture in that respect. Some of it is driven by international trends, and some of it I think will be self-started from home. But we're going to see this continue, and at the same time we do have a lack sometimes of innovative replacement tools for pests, diseases, etc. So producers will have to be innovative, will have to keep an eye out on what's available and speak to their associations and see what is out there, how far are these things along with registration, what options do you have, so we don't get caught by surprise when the Europeans, for example, set minimum residue levels and then we are excluded from the market. Then in the same vein with the packaging, with the global markets, as the packaging is changing in Europe, I expect we'll see the spillover effects to other regulatory regimes. We need to be flexible and say, okay, we think single use is not going to be tossed out completely, but what other options and alternatives are there for my product type? Does it work in terms of cost? Does it work in terms of shelf life, etc.? Will my buyer, will my retailer accept that? Does my retailer have ideas in this regard? It's very important to stay in this modern setting on the edge of what's happening. So I'd say those points, and then if I can end off perhaps on a positive note, we don't have any new free trade agreements happening at the moment with the Middle East or East Asia. We have traditional markets, free trade agreements, Americas, Europe, and Africa. Our most recent one is the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is incredible. It's the largest one in the world outside the WTO. Massive accomplishment for government and industry as well. Works for some sectors better than others. Works very well for grains, cereals, maybe not so much for some of the fruit types. It should work as well for veg, and it does work for veg. But in Middle East and Asia, where we see a lot of growth happening, we're going to have to rely on phytosanitary protocols for market access, which means that producers are going to have to pay particular attention to what's happening in their district. Are there abandoned orchards in the area? Are there risk factors that they can manage amongst themselves in their district or region? Because we're going to see that adherence to phytosanitary protocols is going to be our micro trade agreements for getting into markets and regions. And on a positive note, we're getting into these markets. We're starting to make inroads and getting access for citrus and for deciduous fruit into China, into India. We have a shopping list of export applications into China, Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam, etc., etc. And these things do move. They are slow, but they do move. And although we're in trouble with citrus in the EU and the Americans are perhaps uncomfortable at the moment, I don't see that the overall markets in both fronts are at risk. So I would say that on the global export front, we're going to maintain our momentum as a key producer of export commodities. And so I would say that we should stay positive. We must make sure that we do all those 4 points about this, tracking what we're doing and how we're doing and what we're open to do in terms of new methods. Because these markets are opening to South African producers and exporters. In some cases, sadly, it's because some of our peer competitors are suffering climate change in ways that we are not. But we, on quality, are still, as colleagues have said, incredibly well placed. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. It is just after 15:15, so we're just over time, but thank you very much for everybody attending this discussion. Thank you very much. And I just want to thank specifically my panel, Johan van Deventer, the retired CEO of Freshmark. Johan, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Wolf Broad, Manager Labbased Fruit. Wolf, thank you very much. Professor Naushad Emambo, I hope I've got it right, from the University of Pretoria. Thank you for your contribution. I really appreciate it. And as a first-time attendee to NAMPO, I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I hope it was interesting. And then next to me, Marina Fourie, Project and Brand Manager, Red Meat Industry Services. Thank you very much, Marina. Let's give the panel a hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you.